The civil war in Syria is now entering its 6th year, and 13.5 million people in Syria have been affected, including nearly 6 million children.
According to a new report, it's not just the clothes and food that these children need, but they need psychological help. Joining us now is Tara Kangarlou. She's an international journalist and visiting scholar at the East-West Institute. She's been following this story. Tara, explain the report from Save the Children. What's the headline here?
The headline is that this is an issue that might be irreversible. This is what they're calling an invisible wound, something that we can see, like you mentioned. Lack of housing, food challenges, education challenges are tangible, and we can see it. But the PTSD, psychological issues and trauma that these children and also adults are facing are affecting them, but also the host communities that they're living in.
Well, Tara, absolutely. There's no doubt that these children and adults are under tremendous psychological stress. But when you put things in perspective, that they're being bombed, that they have no food, that they have no shelter, how does that rank as a priority in addressing that issue when basic necessities and livelihood are at stake here?
Absolutely, and I think that's why it took a very long time for large INGOs like Save the Children to put a focus on this. This is an issue that I've been working on for the past 3 years. And when you have a situation where these children can't even do the basic things because they are suffering from this PTSD, to go to that class, to live a normal life, it makes it something that long-term would have an incredibly challenging effect. And again, this month would mark the 6th year anniversary of this war. We are moving into the 7th year, and we're not in an emergency phase anymore. And in a way, millions of these refugees are trying to integrate in these host countries. And if the challenges of trauma and PTSD are not addressed, it's going to lead to conflict and violence.
So in other words, the focus of this is really, and the utility of it is not so much, you know, obviously the children have to survive the war. They have to figure out a way to get out of Syria or get their basic needs met. But once they do, the point is that so many of these children all over the world, all over Europe, that they face incalculable costs in terms of the damage to their psychological health.
Absolutely, and I'll give you an example to that. In this report, among a group of Syrian refugee children in Turkey, they did an assessment. And from that group, 48% suffered from PTSD and trauma, and that is 10 times the amount of what an ordinary child at that age should be facing.
Is there a similarity, though, to other conflicts? I mean, when there are refugees from other conflicts around the world, do you see similar ratios of people who need mental health and have PTSD?
That's a good question, and I think if we look at any trauma, any event that has had a psychological impact, the emotional wounds remain. If we take a look at ourselves, when we lose a loved one, how do we feel? And imagine these children have not only lost loved ones, but they were forced out of their homes, and some of them have witnessed beheadings. The center that I have and work with these refugees in Lebanon, we have children that have witnessed beheadings. And how are we going to send them to school and ask them to pay attention to classes where all they have on their mind is that image?
Well, Tara, one of the concerns has been we're bringing in these refugees and that they could turn out to be harmful to the societies that they're being absorbed into. So what efforts are being made to help the adults and the children better assimilate to prevent that situation from developing?
That's an excellent point, and I think that's why the issue of psychosocial and trauma and PTSD relief is of significance. Because if you don't address that, you're having a generation of children and adults who are suffering incredibly and are suffering from aggression, and some of them are borderline suicidal. So the likelihood of them potentially gearing toward narratives that you and I don't necessarily agree with is high. So at this stage, again, moving into the 7th year of this crisis, the international community, large INGOs should find programming in which they address these issues in addition to education, vocational training, and whatever way they're trying to assimilate these folks.
Well, speaking of that programming, are there particular programs or particular countries around the world that are doing a better job of recognizing this and providing some of these basic psychological services?
I was just in Turkey 2 weeks ago speaking at a conference for education for Syrians, both inside Syria and outside. And one of the topics that was recognized, not just by the Turkish government, but also Syrian NGOs that are, of course, part of the opposition group, was to introduce programming that, in addition to the educational services, would add psychosocial support. But to answer your question, David, not really. You know, this invisible wound has not been on the forefront of many policies, and it's very unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate indeed, Tara, and as we mentioned, with so many needs that need to be addressed, and these refugees really putting an economic toll on their host countries. What would it cost to now add this as well? How much is needed to start to bring in this aspect to helping them assimilate?
The issue of cost, again, in my experience, when you're dealing with psychologists, when you're dealing with therapists, is a long-term cost. It's not that, you know, a group is going in and building tents or building schools, that we can see the immediate results or donors can be pleased. This is an investment, but certainly a worthwhile investment that is going to make everything else a little bit easier when you're trying to assimilate this group. So it's again, in my experience, it's definitely worthwhile, and it's something that donors should focus on. It's
such a horrible story of the PTSD that so many people are suffering, but is at least there a silver lining that people are now talking about this?
You know, I was happy but also disappointed to see this report, because it was a little bit too late. I wish I saw this maybe 3 years ago. But again, happy to have seen it, because it's an invisible wound, but a very deep one that, again, according to this report, can very well not be reversed.
Tara Kangarlou, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.